Hey guys, it's Taran and welcome to the On Track channel and to the 2022 race ratings for the Singapore Grand Prix. So as always, a very warm welcome to these race ratings, a series just taking a bit of a chilled look, having a look at how the drivers did, their performances, their pace, any overtakes, where they finished, where they started, etc, etc. Just having a look at the race in general and seeing how it was and how the drivers have done. As always, spoilers ahead if you've not seen or heard about any of the results from the past weekend, and do make sure to give the video a thumbs up if you've enjoyed it, and subscribe down below for more F1 content. Now with those two things out of the way, let's get into it. Starting with the result, and it is a win for Sergio Perez, doing everything right, starting from second, taking the lead and staying there the whole way. In second, it's Leclerc leading the Ferraris with teammate Sainz in behind. Then in behind them, a great result for Lando in fourth with Ricciardo in fifth. McLaren really getting it right, especially with both Alpines not finishing. In behind them, Lance Stroll, a great performance for the Canadian, Aston Martin picking up valuable points for them. And then Max Verstappen, a chaotic race on the whole, some great moves, but also some mistakes. I mean, ultimately, his great run of form had to come to an end at some point. In behind then, Sebastian Vettel putting up a fight, but eventually having to settle for 8th place. Still ahead of Lewis Hamilton, not his day at all, was in the barrier at one point, comes away with P9. And then finally, Pierre Gasly rounding out the top 10. On to the race itself, and I felt like it was really one that just ebbed and flowed from being either really interesting, loads of stuff happening, or just nothing happening at all. I'll go from the start then, and it was a bad one for Max Verstappen, who was in 8th and was already down to 12th or 13th. Up at the front though, Perez and Sainz both gaining a place, Sainz really getting the elbows out and forcing his way into P3, which turned out to be pretty crucial. Once that all kind of settled down, the top two of Leclerc and Perez were really pulling away, seemed to have pace better than everyone else. And then Latifi went and put Joe into the wall, kind of what we come to expect from him. That brought out the safety car, at which point nobody decided they wanted to pit, so everyone was still on the intermediates, but just really bunched up. And it was at that point where nothing really happened, because the track was very slowly drying, but never quite enough for anyone to either take the proper gamble onto slicks, or to have so much of a pace advantage that they could get past. But then something that kicked off all of the action was Alex Albon, who sent his Williams into the wall and got the front wing lodged in there, also sent him out of the race. But it did give George Russell the chance to come in and try the slick tyres, putting on a set of mediums, but it didn't really work as he was sort of like 5 seconds off the pace at least to begin with. Then there was another VSC for Ocon's engine failing, and actually I forgot to mention Alonso's engine had already failed before that, which brought out a VSC. Then we had Hamilton into the barriers, taking too much speed down into turn 7, and was actually pretty lucky to keep it going, managing to get out of it. No safety car for that, but then everyone started pitting for dries, and someone who did was Yuki Tsunoda, came straight out and went straight into the wall, which brought out another safety car. At which point, anyone who hadn't pitted onto dries did so, and we had the whole grid on slick tyres. At the restart then, big moment for Max Verstappen, trying to get past Lando Norris for I think it was 4th place at the time, completely locks up, goes deep at turn 7, doesn't put it in the wall but does flat spot the tyres, so not only is he then at the back of the pack, but he's also had to make a pit stop, and is really far behind everyone. Up towards the front, and there was a bit of a battle going on. Leclerc was right on the back of Perez, but then eventually just faded away, and eventually it was sort of 7.5 seconds before anything after the race. A bit further back, we had Hamilton and Verstappen both trying to make their way past Sebastian Vettel, with Lewis trying his luck on a little bit of damp track and sliding his way into 9th place behind both of them. And then on the final lap, Verstappen managed to get past Vettel and into 7th place. Overall, I'd say it's just a race of so many incidents, which honestly, I'd kind of forgot that was just how Singapore was. We haven't been there for a couple of years, but this really felt like it encompassed a Singapore Grand Prix. Now onto some ratings, and starting off with the poll from the YouTube channel as always, and for you guys, you've given it a 6.8, which when you consider from the looks of things that a lot of people have said it was either really great or really terrible, somewhere in that range seems about right. And for me, I've actually gone with a 7, which is very close to what you guys have said, but I think that's about where it should be. I feel like that race was either something was happening or absolutely nothing was happening. It was either lots and lots of incidents and safety cars, but between those incidents and safety cars, not much was really going on. Besides a couple of cars sort of chasing down others at points, we didn't have a lot of on-track action, but I guess that's to be expected at a place like Singapore. However, looking back at it, would I say did I enjoy the race full of chaos? And I've got to say yes I did. and so I think a rating of 7 pretty much reflects that. On to teams, and I'm going to start with Williams in what was probably, even by their standards, a really bad weekend. For drivers, I'm going to start with Latifi, who started at the back minus George Russell from the pit lane and was there after the start and wasn't really doing much until on lap 9 he collided with Zhou Guanyu. Zhou coming up on his left side on the outside, Latifi just not really seeing them, he said, I didn't see him in the mirrors, and just basically put him into the wall. So only 9 laps completed, but an incident which was definitely Latifi's fault and took someone else out of the race. I think for him it's got to be like a 2. Ultimately, it's not like a horrific crash or anything, but it's still one that definitely didn't need to be made, and you've taken someone else out in the process. Next up, Alex Albon, and the first thing I've got to say is it's just good to see him back in the car. He's done incredibly well to be physically fit enough to take on Singapore, the toughest race of the season, after all of the complications with his surgery in Monza. However, for Albon, it really wasn't too great of a race. First lap, spun into the barriers and managed to keep the car going, was obviously down into last place, and then just a little bit later on his own, just crashed into the barriers, nose first, managed to keep it going, but it was, I think, suspension damage, and he was out of it. Rating-wise, I think it's got to be a 2.5. He's had more incidents than Latifi, however, he's not taken anyone out of the race, and pace-wise was slightly ahead of the Canadian, but on the whole, still a pretty bad race. Next up, Alpine and a double DNF, both seemingly engine failures, Alonso and Ocon not finishing this one, which drops them a load of points to the rivals McLaren and actually moves them into 5th place. For drivers, I'll start with Alonso, who started the race in, I think it was 5th place, but lost a place to Norris at the very beginning. Did manage to keep pace with Lando ahead of him, but had Max Verstappen breathing down his neck eventually after the initial safety car, and that's where he lost a bit of ground to the McLaren. However, what I will say is that he did defend incredibly well against Verstappen, and in that race, to me at least, seemed to be the only car who looked fairly comfortable almost defending Verstappen. Everyone else seemed to be under real pressure, but Fernando held on pretty well. However, then engine died on lap 21, I think it is, which is still pretty early on into this race. We only had around 50 laps, I think it was. So I was kind of tempted to give him a not applicable rating, but actually I think he's done pretty well. So I'm going to give him a 7, which is fairly solid. He's lost out to Lando, not quite had the pace of the McLaren, but he has defended well to Verstappen behind. Then next up we have Esteban Ocon, who started much further down the grid than his teammate, did make up a few places, avoiding collisions on the first lap, and there was up to about 15th or so. However, just spent most of that time behind Mick Schumacher, couldn't get past the Haas driver, which eventually then became getting stuck behind Yuki Tsunoda once Mick got through. And then on lap 27, just 6 laps after Alonso, his engine died as well. I think for Ocon, it's probably going to have to be a 5 in terms of a rating. On the whole, he's not done anything wrong, he's just seemingly stuck behind cars, not really got past anyone, and then his engine's failed and that's not his fault. But on the whole, 27 laps done, and what I'd say is a slightly under par performance. Next up we have Haas, and considering that only 14 cars finished and 2 of them were Haas cars to come away with no points, that's got to go down as a disappointing race. First off, we have Magnussen, who actually started up in the top 10, but kind of had his race undone just a little bit by contact with Verstappen on the opening lap, where Verstappen honestly kind of squeezes Magnussen towards the barrier, the front left end plate on Magnussen touches the right rear of Verstappen, bit of damage, and he's given the black and orange flag to come in. That puts him to the back, but obviously there's multiple safety cars for, say, like Tsunoda, for example, which did bring him up, and he did make up some places, maybe a little due to other cars making mistakes. However, on the slick tyres, when he was chasing after, say, like Valtteri Bottas in 11th, didn't quite seem to have the pace. So ratings-wise for Magnussen, I think it's going to be a 5. The contact at the start wasn't really his fault, and the pace wasn't looking amazing. However, it must be said that Singapore is a race of attrition, so he's done well to just keep it going and get to the finish. Then next up we have Mick Schumacher, who lost a couple of places early on. I think it was 2 places, down from starting in 12th to 14th. However, did make up a couple through other cars either retiring, such as Alonso and Ocon, or mistakes, say like Tsunoda, who went into anti-stall at one point. So he's slowly making his way up, and after all of the safety cars and everything that happened, he's in 11th place. However, from there, drops back from the cars ahead, loses out to Valtteri behind, and then Verstappen, though that one's more understandable, and then has the collision with George Russell, which is definitely Russell's fault, pulls alongside, moves to the right, collision, not really Schumacher's fault, and from there he's just completely out of it. For a rating for Schumacher, I think it's probably going to have to be like a 4.5. Ultimately, he's not done too amazingly positioning-wise, hasn't really got too close to his teammate either, and that's considering Magnussen had to make the stop early for damage, and the pace in general wasn't amazing or anything. Did defend fairly well against George Russell for probably what was P13, I think. However, his race was pretty much over by that point anyway. Next up, Alfa Romeo, and what I have to say is just kind of an inconspicuous race. In all honesty, I don't think I ever really noticed either of their cars going round on track. For drivers, I'm going to start with Joe as it's a pretty quick one. Didn't have the best of starts and was sort of towards the back of the pack. You know, he was battling with Latifi, which shows where he was, and then kind of got put in the wall by Latifi, which isn't really his fault. So rating-wise, it's going to be a not applicable. You know, the collision happened on lap 9, not too far into the race, and looking at the replays, I'd say it's definitely not Joe's fault. Then on to Valtteri, who, like his teammate, didn't get a great start and found himself further back. Sort of sat between Esteban Ocon and George Russell for quite a while, and he did keep the Mercedes driver behind, but definitely wasn't making any progress into any of the cars ahead. Then later on, once we had all the safety cars and the different VSCs, found himself around 11th place, and he was on the soft tyres, so they'd elected to take those softs for a while compared to some of the others on mediums. Was right up behind Gasly at one point, who eventually finished 10th, but couldn't get a move done, and then slowly as we went further along, the pace on the softs just dropped off, and he fell further back and eventually finished 11th. Rating-wise, I think it's going to be a 5 for Valtteri. You know, you consider the pace on the whole is probably okay, it's about average, but not a great start. That just drops it down below, say, like a 5.5 or a 6. Next up, we have AlphaTauri, and while maybe on the whole they probably would have liked to have capitalised a little bit more on the chaos, to come away with a point having not really scored many on the past few races, I think they'll have to just take it. For drivers, I'll start with Tsunoda, and it really wasn't the best race for him. Started up in the top 10, which is pretty good, and maintained that position on the opening couple of laps. However, then he made a mistake going deep into what I think is turn 8, which actually sent the car into anti-stall, which lost him 2, maybe 3 places, so he was down to sort of 13th or so. Then we get to the point when everyone started changing onto dry tyres, and Tsunoda went from inters to mediums, and on the first or maybe second lap, put it straight into the barriers. That's him out of the race, all done. So rating-wise for Tsunoda, I think it's probably going to have to be like a 3. Ultimately, he's made 2 mistakes in there. One has cost him a number of places, and the other has put him out of the race completely. So on the whole, not a great performance. And then we have Pierre Gasly, who, like his teammate Tsunoda, started up in the top 10, just a little bit higher up. Through the opening laps, managed to sort of maintain his position in front of both the Aston Martins, and then when everyone kind of settled into it, definitely wasn't on the pace of Fernando Alonso ahead of him, but had enough to keep the likes of Sebastian Vettel and Lance Stroll behind. Where he really lost out though was through the safety car pit stops, because he came in for the dry tyres, the mediums, however lost out to both Aston Martin cars as they pitted under the safety car. From there it left him down in I think it was 10th place, where he basically chilled for the rest of the race behind Hamilton and then sort of slowly dropped off of them once everyone got going. So rating-wise for Gasly, I think it's probably going to be a 6.5. On the whole, I'd say it's a decent job. He's maintained position at the start, kept cars behind him, hasn't really put pressure on cars ahead, although, to be honest, wouldn't expect it given he's in the AlphaTauri. And then next up we have Mercedes, and for what was touted to be potentially one of their better weekends of the season, for it to end up being probably what's got to go down as their worst, that's a real disappointment. For drivers, I'm going to start with Russell, and what has to be said is a pretty disastrous race. Started from the pit lane, and obviously that means he's in last place. Then the first thing that went wrong was he went deep at turn 8 while trying to overtake Bottas, just gets too late on the brakes, goes into the escape road, that puts him down towards the back. Then later on, when we had the virtual safety car for I think it was Alex Albon's front wing, he comes in, decides to put on the mediums, which at the time was kind of understandable. People were talking about dry tyres and he's got nothing to lose. However, then refused to sort of change off of them when they realised that they really weren't the tyres to be on, which isn't great. Then later on in the race, even after the safety car closed everyone up, had the incident with Mick Schumacher, where he's pulled alongside, should probably get past considering he's on the inside, and just moved to his right and hit Schumacher, and then he's got a puncture and he's got to come in again. Rating wise for George, it's got to go down as like a 2, something around that range. Ultimately, he's made a number of mistakes. He's stayed out on the tyres when they probably should have brought him in. Maybe that's a little bit more on the team. However, from the radios I was hearing, he kind of said, right, we're sticking with the mediums now. And then obviously you have the next collision with Schumacher on what is got to go down as his worst race of the season by far. Then next up we have Hamilton, who started up in P3 but was down to P4 in the first few corners. Did kind of get pushed wide by Sainz, I'll say, but on lap 1 that's bound to happen. It's not worthy of a penalty or anything like that. So then he's down to 4th place. And that was sort of the beginning of where it kind of came undone, because being stuck behind Sainz, who we'll get onto was incredibly slow, forced him to really push a bit too hard, and where eventually midway through the race, after keeping pace with Sainz and probably having more than the Ferrari, made the mistake of locking up into turn 7 and went straight into the barriers, and honestly was really lucky to be able to carry on. I think it's the fact that he's hit those barriers straight on. We've seen it a number of times with these cars this year. If you hit it straight on, you might get away with it. So he did, comes back out, then has to come in, change the front wing, goes on to the dry tyres, and then we have the safety car, which means he probably loses a little bit more to the likes of the Aston Martins behind. So yeah, that really didn't go well for him. From there, finds himself basically stuck behind Seb Vettel the entire way, can't really get the mediums working later on. Does go for a move on Seb, I think he kind of had to, gets onto the damp track, slides a bit, doesn't make the move, Verstappen gets through as well. So the way I would kind of look at that race for Lewis is pace-wise was probably very good, better than Sainz, probably not going to be as quick as a Leclerc or a Perez, but definitely had good pace, just a couple of mistakes in there, one of which was absolutely huge, which has dropped him down. So ratings-wise for Lewis, I think it's got to go down as a 3.5. It's not like a 1.52 because ultimately his mistake, he's managed to carry on from it. It's not put him out of the race, and besides that, was driving fairly well, I think. Next up is Aston Martin in what is definitely their best race of the season, and actually leapfrogs them both over AlphaTauri and Haas, I think, into 7th place in the Constructors. For drivers, I'm going to start with Sebastian Vettel, and he's made up, I think, 4 places on the opening lap. If you get a chance, have a look at the replay from his camera. Honestly, he gets a really great drive, then positions his car really well, makes some nice moves, and he's up 4 places. From there, he's ahead of his teammate, ahead of Lance Stroll, who's behind him, and actually drops back quite a bit. Before all the safety cars in the middle of the race for like Tsunoda, I think Vettel's gained about 6 seconds to his teammate, and only loses out on that position because he pitted just before the safety car, whereas Stroll managed to pit during the safety car. And then we saw afterwards, when he had Hamilton and Verstappen breathing down his neck, he was still right by Stroll, so I definitely think pace-wise, he's got it over his teammate. Defended perfectly against Lewis, forced him onto the damp track in order to get past, which was a mistake by Hamilton, and he kept that place compared to him. Verstappen then gets past, obviously softer tyres, it's Max, probably a little bit more inevitable if you'd say. However, on the whole, for Vettel, it's an incredibly good race. Ratings-wise for him, I think it's going to be an 8.5. As I said, had he not, been a bit unlucky with the timing of the safety car, he stays ahead of Stroll, probably finishes up in 6th place, having his best race of the season. And then we get to Lance, who didn't have a bad start or anything, sort of maintained his position. And as I just said, pace-wise, definitely wasn't on the same level as Seb, was dropping back, and eventually it was sort of 6-ish seconds by the time we had all those safety cars. However, does get lucky with the timing and is ahead of Vettel and manages to keep him there and Verstappen behind, although that's more on Seb's part. So I think for Stroll, comparing to Vettel, you'd have to say pace-wise definitely wasn't there, but no mistakes, it's still a very solid race. So rating for him, I think it probably goes down as like a 7. It's a fairly solid race, it's a really good drive, he's managed to keep cars behind him earlier on in the race, and has got a bit lucky with the safety car in the end. Next up we have McLaren, who, like Aston Martin, have just had what is most definitely their best race of the season, and as I mentioned with the Alpine segment, has jumped McLaren up into 4th place. For drivers, I'm going to start with Daniel Ricciardo, who began the race down in 16th, but did make up 3 places on the opening lap, so he was up to 13th then, and wasn't making any progress from there. However, what did give him a load of places was pitting under the safety car for Tsunoda, stayed out long enough and then was up to about 5th place, pitted under the safety car and came out in about 6th, I think, with Verstappen in 5th and Norris in 4th. However, what we then saw from there was Ricciardo on softer tyres compared to Norris, just falling so far back. Even when both of them had fresh sets of tyres, Ricciardo was losing maybe, half a second, 6 tenths, 8 tenths at least per lap to Norris. And by the end of that, even with, yes, the soft tyres will drop off a little bit, was over 30 seconds behind his teammate. So rating-wise for Ricciardo, I think it's going to be a 6. He's gained some places early on, and honestly, he's finished in 5th place, which is a great result for him and the team. However, the pace at the end definitely drags it down from what you would probably expect from a 16th to 5th place drive. Then we get on to Lando, who actually had a really good race. He jumped Fernando Alonso at the start, which was really key because it turned out, he did have that little bit more pace than the Alpine behind him. And actually what we saw on that stint on the intermediates was he kept a closer gap to Hamilton ahead of him than Sainz did to the likes of Leclerc and Perez. So pace-wise for Norris, compared to either the cars around him or his teammate, as I've just discussed with Ricciardo later on, was really, really, really good. And when you consider at the end of it, he's finished in 4th place, was even putting pressure on Sainz at the end in that medium tyre stint. It's a really good drive from Lando. Rating-wise, it's going to be a 9. There's really not too much more to say. He's done what he needed to do at the start. The pace was really good. He's even challenged cars a little bit that he really shouldn't be challenging. So on the whole, for Lando, it's got to go down as one of his best drives of the season. So next up we have Ferrari, and while they probably would have wanted to come away with the win given its slow speed probably suits their car, they've pulled out a load of points ahead of Mercedes, which at this point in the season is what's really important for them. For drivers, I'm going to start with Leclerc, who actually doesn't have a ton to talk about. So he lost the lead at the first turn to Perez and then just was behind him the entire time. There were points when he looked really close and he looked to definitely have the pace advantage over him, over Perez that is. However, then later on in the race, Checo just pulled away and Leclerc had no answer. And the way I kind of look at Leclerc's race is the pace on the whole was good and compared to Sainz was incredibly good. However, didn't quite manage to get the move done on Perez and then also lost out at the start. So rating wise, I think it's probably going to have to be a 7.5. On the whole, I think he has driven very well. The pace is very good and compared to his teammate, it's very good. But you've lost first place and you haven't quite been able to get past, and then Checo's pulled away from him at the end. And then we have Carlos Sainz, who I would say great turn 1, getting up into 3rd place, and from there, the rest of it is just not great. Whether it was the intermediate tyres or they're on the slick tyres towards the end, the pace compared to Leclerc was just really poor. And not to the point of you go, oh, he's a little bit off of Leclerc, he's not quite doing as well this weekend. It was really, really far off, and it was really clear to see. And honestly, that's the only real talking point I have for Sainz's race. Like, when I think about it, he gets into P3 at the start, and from there is basically just defending Hamilton until Hamilton crashed, and afterwards was defending even Norris for a bit, who's in a much slower McLaren. Rating-wise for Sainz, I think it's probably got to go down as either a 4, maybe a 4.5, I think is probably what I'm going to go with, because at the end of the day, he has come away with a podium and kept the car that he was kind of fighting the most in that race, Hamilton, behind him. However, pace-wise to Leclerc, really far off. And finally, we have Red Bull, who were actually tied on points with Ferrari, but obviously with the win, finished just ahead of them for this race, and what a win it was. For this one, I'm going to start with Verstappen, and honestly, saying started P8 and finished P7 really does not tell the entire story. So from the start, had a terrible getaway, went into anti-stall, I think, dropped about 4, maybe 5 places, was down from 8th to about 12th or 13th. However, we did see some really nice moves straight away early on while the cars were close together, getting him back up into 10th or 9th place. And from there was generally picking off cars until he got stuck behind Alonso for a bit. However, Alonso's car died, which meant he got past him. And then when all the safety cars came out for Tsunoda's crash during the middle of the race and they swapped all onto the dry tyres, it meant he was up into 5th. So on the whole, bad start, but from there has done quite well. However, what happens next is his big undoing and his big mistake. At the restart, goes up the inside of Norris, goes in far too quickly, far too deep, locks up, takes to the escape road, and not only does that lose him a number of places, but means he has to stop for new tyres because he's flat spotted the ones he's on. The way I kind of see it is it's almost in a way a similar outcome as to the Hamilton incident, although yes, Lewis hit the barriers. They've both lost positions and been forced to make another pit stop, so the effect is kind of similar, maybe Verstappen's isn't quite as bad. From there, the progress on the soft tyres was really good. He was making progress, making overtakes, and then when he came up to the back of Hamilton and Vettel, just bided his time, waited for Lewis to have to make a move. You know, I would honestly say that Verstappen being there forced Hamilton to have to make a move and make the mistake on Vettel. And then once Lewis was out of the picture, made the move on Vettel on the final lap to get P7. So on the whole, looking at the entire race for him, for Verstappen, I think the rating I'm going to give him is a 4. And the way I would sum up Verstappen's race is, other than that mistake, he was driving very well, making overtakes, did get stuck behind Alonso a bit, but ultimately it's that big mistake that's cost him. It's not put him out of the race, but it has definitely limited him to, honestly, what could have been a win considering that the safety car bunched the entire field back up. So yeah, a very uncharacteristic 4 for Verstappen. And then finally we have Sergio Perez, who takes the win in a chaotic Singapore Grand Prix, and honestly he's not really done too much wrong. Takes the lead pretty cleanly into the first turn, goes up the inside, nice as you like, into first place. From there, just keeps Leclerc behind, generally at an arm's distance. There were points when it looked like Leclerc could probably have a go at him, maybe make a late lunge, especially, there was a point in that dry stint towards the end. But on the whole, Perez has just kept his nerve, driven really, really well, and taken the win. A few potential problems with the safety car restarts, not staying within 10 car lengths, but from the sounds of things, they should all be fine. And in that case, it's a well-deserved win for Checo. Got into the lead, not really done anything wrong. So rating-wise, I think it goes down as a 9. It's not a 9.5 or a 10 or anything like that, just because when you consider that for most of the race, Leclerc was pretty much right behind him, it's not like he's absolutely destroyed the competition or anything, but still a brilliant drive from Checo. So that just about rounds out the race ratings for the Singapore Grand Prix, with the likes of Perez, Norris and Vettel right up there at the top, and well, quite a lot of drivers down the other end. I've got to say, as the ratings have gone this season, this has to go down as the one where most drivers, or the most amount of drivers, haven't had great races, and I guess when you consider it's Singapore, a tricky street track combined with tricky weather conditions, it probably makes sense, the most mistakes made over the course of the race. And then we have the updated standings. It's still Max Verstappen right up there at the top. However, his lead has taken a bit of a hit to those behind, and then in behind, people like Hamilton and Russell, both Mercedes drivers, really not having the best of days, so they've gone down in rating as well. Further back, a good race from Vettel helps him out, and right at the bottom, as always, Mr. Consistency, Nicholas Latifi. But anyways, that is all for now. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed, and if you have, make sure to give the video a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe down below for more F1 content. But until next time, take care.